Welcome to the Writers Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with authors a little less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. My name is Zach Powers. I'm the artistic director at the Writers Center. I'm also a fiction writer and novelist, and that's why I get to have this chat today. So it's really, really my pleasure to welcome Lisa Ko to the virtual craft chat to talk about Memory Piece a little bit, the brand new, I still say brand new. It's been a month plus now, but it's still brand new in the way that the book world works. So Lisa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
And you have the book handy, so could you just read us a brief excerpt so we get a feel of what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the evening?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just read straight from the beginning, so the first page or so. Before the raids, before the hidden compartments and career retrospectives, there was a lonely girl in her room. A lonely girl in a vast cocoon of a bedroom with her own computer, privacy unquestioned. A lonely girl in a busy suburb, brother's weights dropping across the hall, mother scolding her for spending too much time in her notebooks. A lonely girl in an apartment shared with sisters and then alone. Secret journal entries, pilfered booze, furtive masturbation. They were born in the same year. Their family is part of a network of Hong Kong Chinese and Taiwanese and Malaysian Chinese and Chinese Filipinos around New York. Differences flattened by proximity of exile. Some families stayed in the city, while others, like Giselle Chin's, flighted to the suburbs, existing in an alternate reality of holidays and weekends. Thanksgiving turkeys with sticky rice, Chinese New Year parties with parents Bellato and Maudlin as they sang along to Teresa Tang, after which Giselle would fall asleep in the backseat of her family's Chevy Woodwagon on the ride back to Jersey. On Saturday mornings, Giselle and her brother Alexander went to Chinese school in a Hackensack church basement with the other Juxing kids and one white dad who had a Chinese wife and kid, where they learned how to count in Mandarin and replicate Xeroxes of brush paintings with ink. The Way's 4th of July barbecue was supposed to be a summer reunion for the Chinese school students and their families. Larry Way, a year younger than Giselle, made his presence known as she circled a table of potato chips and onion dip. Guess what, he said, mouthful. I made a sandwich out of chips with chips inside. She considered ignoring him. The TV was on and Giselle was surprised to see Jackie Ong slouched on the sofa, hair cut in a short, sleek angle following her jawline. Jackie lived in a town with no public schools because all the kids were rich and went to private. Jeans looked stylish on her without trying, while Giselle's were bunched around her crotch. She had a wedgie, her butt was sweating, and around Jackie Ong, she felt like she stomped when she walked. This was 1983. Chinese school wasn't like regular school, where boys made kung fu shouts as they pelted Giselle's face in gym class dodgeball. Jackie had arrived at Chinese school the previous year, at the end of 5th grade. One Saturday, when they were supposed to be painting pictures of flowers during culture hour, Giselle pressed her brush against the paper to drip shapes with the ink, large blots of black against smaller, lighter ones. And across the table, Jackie said, "Very Jackson Pollock." Giselle didn't know who that was, but figured she should pretend. She said, "Oh yeah?" The teacher came over and shushed them, but Jackie flashed her own painting at Giselle. She'd colored the entire piece of paper in solid black. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
So in your own words, who the heck are you?
Who the heck am I? Well, I'm Lisa Ko. I'm a writer. I'm a person. I'm a New Yorker. I'm a longtime New Yorker who grew up in New Jersey, like my characters. And I'm primarily a novelist. My first novel, The Leavers, came out in 2017. And my second novel, Memory Piece, came out, like you mentioned, about 6 weeks ago. So both new and not new. And I've also written and published short stories and essays, but never poetry. So we'll see about that.
No. I'm not saying necessarily write poetry or fiction.
I know. I read
but,
poetry.
read it. So like the first real question is the love-hate question. Some authors really like it and some hate it, so hopefully you fall into the love category, which is, what's a question you really wish someone would ask about your writing or writing practice? In other words, what haven't you gotten to speak about before?
This is such a hard question. Like what haven't you been asked that you'd like to be asked, right? It's like a negative, like positive question. But when I was thinking about it, I thought of like wanting to ask other writers, as well as maybe wanting to be asked myself about the non-writing practice of the writing practice. In other words, I'm just always curious about what things people do besides writing. Because so many of the writing questions are around writing, which makes sense, but also the writing process encompasses so much more, with which is like life itself, right? And in so many ways, whether it's like reading or like, I don't know, like I love riding my bike and like singing karaoke and like, doing other work that's very non-writing related. I just find that very fascinating and like interesting to see like how it ties into the writing process and how it doesn't.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yep.
So getting to craft a little bit. So I want to talk point of view because I think this novel is a great novel to talk point of view on because each of the three novels, three large sections focuses on one of the three main characters. So we go from a unique point of view in each section, focusing on one of the three main friends that are introduced at the beginning. So focusing on the technical perspective, this is for the audience. The first section is third person past tense. The second section is third person present tense. And the third section is first person past. I believe I have that right. I was confusing myself with like numbering sections and anyway, I think that's right. So I guess the question just is why did you select unique point of views for the main characters? And maybe also more interestingly, why these particular points of view for the particular characters?
Mm-hmm. I think, well, I want to start by saying I never know where I'm going when I start writing a novel. So I started off by wanting to write about the longtime friendship between these women characters who are kind of creative collaborators in their own ways. And so it started off with the Jackie and Giselle characters. And the chapter that I just read from was actually not written till much later on in the process, although it chronologically comes before all the other scenes. So I feel like a lot of writers have a point of view that they feel, I don't know, just more like organically is easy for them. And for me, that's a close third. I find first person sometimes very challenging because I don't know, it just feels like a little too claustrophobic and too, I don't know, self-obsessive for me. So I find third person to be where I'm gravitating towards. So I wrote first Jackie and Giselle, kind of neither of them being the main character, both in third. And as I was writing and trying to figure out what the story was, I realized about 2 years in that Ellen, the third character, was actually the third main character, not just like a good friend of both the character, both Jackie and Giselle, but and arguably maybe the protagonist of the book itself, which could be argued. And I realized like while writing that I wanted the structure of the book and the tone of the sections to sort of mimic the experience of moving through time. So moving from the 1980s and Giselle's section being like a style of a kind of like artist biography where we were learning about her development, both as a person and as an artist in a very kind of mundane suburban childhood way, and then moving to Jackie's section, which is in a much more compressed period of time. So it's 1 year from 1999 to 2000, and kind of high stakes drama of like, the dot-com industry, and it's a little absurd. And the point of view is like, is third person and also present tense to mimic that kind of, I don't know, fast-paced, time and tone. And then realizing that when I moved to the future, I wanted Ellen's point of view to be in first person because she's sort of more reflective and able to sort of look back on both Jackie and Giselle sections and the past and how it kind of leads to the world where she's living in now. And I think when you're working with those different points of view, you can sort of play them off one another too, right? You can have characters kind of comment on each other without explicitly commenting on each other, and the reader might know things that the characters don't.
I was thinking dramatic irony when I was reading that. Like this is a great method for dramatic irony. Um, so this is just on revising this. Did a lot of that happen in revision? Because it seems like you didn't necessarily plan super carefully out at the beginning. Do you like go in revision? Is this when you're noticing moments that this character can suddenly reflect in a way? And also just I guess there's two ways about thinking about this: is how the reader, how you perceive it as a writer once you have everything and know everything, but then also
Mhm.
considering how a reader perceives it, because a reader is going to get this one perspective, then the second character has a slightly broader perspective, and moving on like that.
Right, right, right. Yeah, I think it's something that I remember hearing about, which I realized was really helpful, was to create, and this is all very, very late in the revision process. I feel like 99% of the process for me feels like revision because I don't write in a linear way. So it's never kind of moving from a cohesive first draft to a cohesive second draft, or from a beginning to the end. You know, a lot of it is just me struggling to figure out what the hell I'm writing, and like who these people are and what they're doing. And over time, you know, it's, I don't know, I wrote an essay about it recently, which is just sort of like, I feel like it's just feeding this like big pile of junk, you know, and I'm just like feeding it and feeding it. And then eventually kind of like taking it away and cleaning it up. So it's years of like making a mess and then years of like cleaning up the mess. So yeah, I at one point I realized that I needed to create timelines of both like what the characters were doing and what they knew, and also a timeline of what the reader knows, right? So, and then that can sort of be used strategically, because there are definitely scenes in the process of revision where you realize like, okay, I want to impart this information to the reader at this time versus this time, and different scenes were moved forward and backwards in the book according to where I wanted the reader to kind of both glean that information and where I felt it would be more emotionally effective for the reader to know that information. So there are times in which scenes aren't fully revealed until later in the book. There's one where the same scene is repeated twice in the Jackie section and the Giselle section, but we don't fully learn what happens until the second section.
Mhm. Great, thank you. So I mentioned I have a curveball question and not one of the ones I sent you, and I'm thinking about those like novels of friendship, and I find
Mhm.
friendship to be like, maybe I'm just jaded and tired of love stories, but like friendship, and not there isn't love appearing in here in different ways, but I think friendship is such a fertile ground for writing, and maybe there's way more friendships than there are other than loving relationships, romantic relationships. So, do you have any thoughts on like the literature of friendship and why that sort of topic drew you in and led to this project?
I mean, I definitely wanted to read it, you know, and I think I wanted to write about like the friendship of women that were just really obsessed with their work. And I kind of wanted it to be, I don't know, not like consciously in the beginning, but I realized I was writing kind of against that heteronormative model of like these women's stories. So it's less about like who they're going to marry, or like even the relation, even though they are all in different romantic relationships, but it's really about that long-term friendship and how that affects their lives, both consciously and unconsciously. And you know, as just kind of like as you were saying, like there, it feels like there's just a murkier ground for like how we treat friendships or the roles of them in our lives, you know, and for instance, like there's just a lot more, I don't know, like understanding maybe even around like a romantic breakup or a divorce or a marriage ending versus a friendship ending, for instance, even though that happens with regularity, right? And can be as or even more heartbreaking or transformative. So yeah, I think that really drew me to wanting to write about it. And I've also loved like, you know, the Elena Ferrante books, and the ways that so many stories of like female friendships in particular, and like kind of stories of creative collaborators who sort of drift apart and like come together in different ways. And those themes just like really interest me.
Yeah, so maybe I have some character questions, but we may have covered those. So maybe I'll come back in a bit for character, but I have I've never gone quite this geeky on a craft chat with like words. So I think I'm gonna experiment with like my inner word geek right now. So I would call myself a recursive writer, which means I sort of am looking backwards and noticing things I've written when I move forward and carrying over sometimes very practically pieces of words and things like that. And so occasionally when I slow down in other pieces, I start noticing those really clearly. And I found that just through, I mean, I feel like I could have stopped on any paragraph and found a sentence that was an example of this. But oh, for example, I have a quote here. So from page 60, there was the sentence, "Downtown was abandoned, then gentrified and hastily rebuilt. the foundation already rotten. There's some consonances and dissonances and assonances with downtown and abandoned and foundation and rotten. And then in the middle, there's the gentrified, hastily rebuilt. There's some additional assonances in there. So I guess the question is sort of about the sonics of your sentences as you're writing. How do you hear what you write? Because I can't imagine that happened without you hearing it. And what are you searching for in terms of those sonic qualities of words in relation to each other?
Wow, I love this question so much. I love the geekiness of it. Actually, this is a question that I've never been asked. So um, I appreciate that you like noticed it too. I feel like it's a quality that I just know and I feel it, right? And like I was thinking about this in terms of just like words. I feel like a lot of writers, we have words and like even names that we have very strong feeling towards for no like logical reason. They just like feel wrong or they feel good. And I think there's a quality in terms of the rhythm of my sentences that I just know when it feels good, like it feels right in the body. And I think of it as sort of musical too, in a way. Like I played the piano for many years as a child. Like I feel like it was an early language of mine. So I often think of like the ways that words feel on the keyboard, like tactily, and then like also just how they look visually and how they feel as I speak them out loud and how they feel as I hear them as I read, right? There's like the voice of the text spoken aloud, and there's the voice of the text as it's spoken in your head as you read it. So I do end up like reading everything I write out loud just to feel that and to edit and revise. And I also like look at it in different formats. Like I like to change things from, it's on my screen and then it's like printed out. And then sometimes I put it on a Kindle to see what the experience of reading that way is. And I think it's interesting to see like what lands and what changes in those different formats. But I can always sort of hear like the rhythm that I want the sentences to have. And so much of it is also to sort of like the mouthfeel of the words, like you mentioned.
You hinted really briefly too at the other part of language I want to talk to, which was how they look. And so a example from page 26 was a pepperoni pizza lay ravaged on the table, leaking oil in a Snapple bottle stuffed with cigarette butts, which first of all sounds amazing too, but there are 6 double letters in that sentence which don't sound, because they don't sound. The second letter is always silent, but there's no way that sentence didn't occur without being somewhat aware of the double letters appearing there, because it's such a beautiful looking sentence to me, and I love that. I think that's an ignored part of word geekiness, is that it's also a visual thing on a page, and sometimes taking advantage of that is to your benefit as well. So is that something you are? I'm assuming you're aware of, because that sentence happened, but yeah.
I'm aware of it, but it's so interesting. I don't think I consciously wrote that sentence with that knowledge in mind. I don't even think I ever thought about the double letters until you mentioned it. But now I'm like, oh, that makes sense. That's so interesting, like how the brain sort of like makes that happen without consciously thinking of it. Like I'm not going into it being like, I want to put these things together,
I bet it's related to the awareness of the sonic quality, though, because there's something similar mindset, I feel like, that like, okay, that's not sounding, but it is making the brain follow a rhythm where those double letters hit within the sentence.
Right.
The internal sounding versus the out loud sounding is still doing something rhythmically.
Definitely. And I think, I also find like a repetition and an echo sometimes to be funny. Like there's sort of an absurdity to it. So I think that might be something I'm unconsciously seeking out, when I'm writing these kinds of sentences. But yeah, to answer your question, like I look a lot about like how the words visually appear and how like the white space appears. And also like the spaces between sections or chapters, like where do you take a breath? And where does the page cut off or where does the section cut off? And that feels really important to me.
Yeah, I know like paragraph length for me makes such a huge difference in a piece, and there isn't a right one. Sometimes you want this ridiculously dense long paragraph, and sometimes you want them to be 2 to 3 sentences and lots of little sentence paragraphs separated by space, whatever, anything just changes the, yeah.
Yeah, one thing sometimes I do is make the text really, really small. So I'll put it like in Word and then I'll make the view like 5% or something like that. So you could see
Oh,
like you can see like a 200-page manuscript on like one page, and it's just these kind of dark gray fuzzy things, right? And then it's almost like becomes like a visual art piece where you can sort of, I don't know, just like see the like where it gets busy and where it stops and like where there's a lot of it, and then assess it as like a whole, as like one large piece, and like how does that feel? And are there places that feel busier? Like what's the arc of it, visually as well as like story wise?
yeah, that's great. Thank you. There's a couple questions in the chat, so I'm going to go there and just remind everyone that we do welcome questions in the chat window, and I will ask as many of them as possible. The first question, oh, I lost it. There we go. Did you write the novel from start to finish, did you do it in parts and then compile it?
Mm. I definitely did it in parts. And I feel like every time I write a novel, I'm like, I'm gonna outline. I'm gonna be one of those people that outlines, I don't, it just feels like this kind of mysterious person, the writer who outlines and then like knocks it out in a year. Or, I don't know, does that exist? But I like aspire to be one, and then I have to accept that I'll never probably be one.
Mhm.
So yeah, I definitely end up writing in parts and writing a lot and then deleting a lot.
Great,
A lot.
thank you.
Yeah.
So someone was asking, you mentioned that you had recently completed an essay earlier.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Does that exist as a link somewhere, yet?
It does. Yeah, it's actually on LitHub.
LitHub. Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
Go to LitHub. You can Google LitHub, you will find LitHub and you can find it there. So,
yeah.
thank you. All right. And then to the chat again, how do you know that you're done revising and that's it? Do you have a reader you turn to, or do you decide yourself it's ready to submit?
Mm. I feel like this is so hard for me. I spent 5 years writing this novel before I showed it to anybody. And part of that was, I think, my own stubbornness about not wanting outside input until I figured out how to solve the problems myself. So I kept feeling like I knew there were problems, and if I just put more attention or gave it more space or did more research or revision, then somehow I would come to the place, where I could figure out what the manuscript needed. And I was afraid that if I sought out input from anybody, and I had definitely had other writer friends, I have an agent, like people who could give me valuable advice, but I was afraid that it would not be useful because I hadn't figured it out myself. I don't think this is necessarily the right way to go. I think it put a lot of pressure on the book and on me to figure out how to keep going, to sort of both be able to look at my work critically to figure out what the problem was and how to solve it, and then also motivate myself. Like it's sort of a lot of like internal work to sustain over a number of years. So I realized at some point, like I felt like I was sort of like a rat in the wall, sort of like taking all this stuff and just sort of building a nest that was getting very unruly. And at some point I was just like, I just really need someone to tell me what to do. And then I finally sent it to my agent and had weeks of freaking out because I was just like, what if she hates it? And I've just wasted 5 years of my life. That was a terrible decision. But fortunately she said it was like in good shape, and kind of gave me next steps on how to revise. But I'm hoping this next manuscript, whatever it is, I will not do that.
I mean, I will say, first of all, I'm similar to you. I want to do as much of the work myself before bringing someone else in. I don't know. I don't know. That's what feels right to me. I don't think there's any real compulsion there. But I will
Mhm.
say, on the other hand, I always bring up in this conversation, I bring up my friend Joe, who's an author, and I was in like a writer's group with him for years, and he will bring in like just something really early and be
Mhm.
like, okay, talk it through, and he'll bring back the next thing, and it's like amazing. Like
Wow.
the first one is like super rough, like, and the new thing is like nothing like the original and amazing. So his like process is to bring it in a very early, very rough state for sort of feedback and groupthink. Then he goes back into his hole and does the work himself and comes back with like this really polished thing. So
Huh. That's
yeah,
so
can never do
yeah.
it. Can never do it myself, but just try things and don't necessarily just borrow someone else's technique on that, because a lot of things. Um, uh, referring back to what we were just talking about, could you talk a bit more about the kinds of problems you were seeking to solve before you showed your manuscript to others? What kind of problems were you identifying, I guess, and wanting to work out the kinks before someone else saw it?
I think with this one, it was really trying to figure out what the story was, right? And also how the pieces fit together, and it was not only about figuring out the individual storylines for each of the three characters, but also figuring out how they worked in relation to one another. So, the sort of micro storylines of the individual friendships, but also the macro storylines of like how they're different industries of tech and art and housing and real estate and activism all kind of work together in the machinery of it. And a lot of that was just try to like figure that out through trial and error. I think, writing each of the sections, trying to figure out what order the scenes should be in, trying to figure out like where to end it and like what note I wanted the manuscript as a whole to end on. And figuring out what worked through what didn't work.
Great. Thank you. Again, to the chat window, how do you know what parts to delete, especially when there are multiple options that the character could take?
Mm. I think you kind of realize what isn't working. And there was a lot of that. I wrote like an entire version of the book that had the characters time travel. Like I wrote a version where all three of them were in a performance group together, and at some point, like each of those things kind of petered out because I realized like I wasn't engaged in it. It wasn't the right direction, it was sort of taking the story afield in a place that didn't make sense. I think further along in the process becomes more apparent where you can like kind of read it over as a whole and trim down the excess very easily. Like, I like to ask myself, like, what purpose is each scene doing? And there might be maybe too many scenes that sort of do the same work, right? For instance, there might be 5 scenes about a character's relationship with her father where maybe you only need 1, right? Or like, just too many things sort of being redundant or slowing down, I think, the movement too, right? You might have scenes that are sort of just like pretty and and at some points like having the trajectory of the story slow down is good, and at some points like it's actually not doing the work it should be.
I'll say too, one of my indicators is always if I'm really struggling to revise something, I have learned now, like after a certain point, it's like the answer is probably just cut that.
Usually the answer is cut
Like you can't fix this because it's not supposed to be there. That's the reason it's not
yeah.
working. Yeah.
That's a great point. Yeah. Like if you're trying too hard to justify
Yeah.
and like they're clinging to it too much, it's
Yeah.
usually a sign that like you're trying to find a reason for it to fit because you
It-
don't have a good reason.
It's usually something silly too. It's usually not even important. You're just like, why can't I make the sentence work? Why can't I make this little paragraph work? And like,
Right.
oh, because the answer was it didn't need to be there. But
And it's always like because you're attached to it, at least for me, I'm like, I'm just really attached to it because I wrote it along, like I have fond memories of it, or like that line is really funny, and I'm like, well, you can use that somewhere else.
do you save things you delete, or do you ever just delete things?
I save things like it's every, like it's all on my computer. So like it's like nothing can be really thrown away. It feels it's always like there in another folder.
Yeah.
But I do have like a file, like I call it like compost. So I kind of dump it all in there.
Mhm. I like our folder names for those for those
Yeah,
folders. The authors have good folder names.
I know. Someone should write like a piece that's all those
Yeah.
names, like our discarded folders.
Okay, back to the chat window. You recently had a conversation with Rachel Kong for Real Americans. Her book features 3 different points of view. Oops, I lost the thing there real quick. Sorry. Did both of you subtly influence each other, or have a common inspiration?
That's a great question. I just saw Rachel in conversation last night here in New York City. And I love her book, Real Americans. I did not read that book until like a few months ago. So and had no idea like what she was writing about. And I also just love how authors might sort of be on a similar obsessive, like, have a similar set of like obsessions, whether it's thematically, content wise, or structure wise, and not even know it. I find that happens like all the time.
Thank you.
Yep.
Just real quick, thank you, Melody, put the link for the LitHub article into the chat window. So if you are looking for that, you don't even have to Google it now. Someone did it for us. So thank you so much, Melody. That is really helpful. We have a publishing question coming in. How hard was it finding an agent slash publisher? Was it important to find the right fit as a member of the AAPI community?
How hard is it finding an agent and publisher? I I sort of had a reverse kind of trajectory with that. I found my agent, who I still work with, after I got the book deal for my first book, because I got the book deal for The Leavers by submitting to a contest
Mm.
for unpublished first manuscripts. So, I do want to say that I found both my publisher and my agent through the slush pile. Like I won the contest, and then I was like, I need to find an agent. What do I do? And I ended up just sort of emailing a bunch of agents that I wanted to work with, and seeing who responded to me, and sort of interviewing the folks who were interested, and just wanting to find the right fit, So I guess that question is like, you know, wanting to find like an agent who really resonated with my work, understood what I was doing, was really, I don't know, like in line with me, and I think that can mean a lot of things based on like both your identity and like your, artistic like form and like what you're looking for. But I feel like it's sort of like dating, you like kind of know when it's working and like when something clicks.
So this was your first time on submission for a
Yeah.
novel with an agent submitting a novel on your behalf. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And I ended up changing publishers, but not changing agents for this
Okay.
one.
And which did you like better, slush pile contest entry or the agent editor relationship?
The agent editor relationship is definitely a lot easier
Yes.
than the slush file. Yeah.
I have done both as well, so I'm like, yeah, I definitely the easier one.
Yeah, definitely easier to get a response.
Yeah. All right, scrolling down real quick. This is a really interesting question. Have you had a finished novel manuscript or manuscripts that have been in a way practice? I guess that means ones that have not left the the folders on your computer.
Not anything that's been written to completion. Um, I had well, I guess have, because it still exists, like a short story collection that I worked on and off on for several years, maybe like 5 to 7 years before my first novel. A few of which were published in magazines and in journals, but never really cohered into a complete collection. But I've never written a novel to completion. Although I feel like I've written the word count equivalent of many novels in the process of trying to figure out a novel. So maybe that counts.
Yeah, we'll go with that. Yes, yes. A lot of writing that doesn't necessarily get ever shared or published.
Yes.
Yeah. Jackie, thanks for asking this question again. I realized I jumped over yours and forgot to go back.
Mhm.
So the question is, did you pitch your novel as literary fiction, or how did you pitch it? What was sort of the pitch for the novel? I
Mm.
guess both to your agent, and then how did you and the agent pitch it to editors?
For Memory Piece or for the first novel?
I guess let's start with Memory Piece, and then maybe we can do both since it's yeah.
Yeah. I think Memory Piece was pitched as literary fiction. And I believe The Leavers was as well, although, it did come from the slush pile. So I think it was just sort of pitched to my agent as like, I won this award. Would you like to work with me? Here's the synopsis. Yeah. And of course, like we ended up working on the pitch together for Memory Piece. Mm.
Was there any, I mean, was it lit fic all the way? There was no pushback or anything on
Mm.
trying to make it
No,
more
I don't. Mm-mm.
good. Good. All right. Keep the questions coming in the chat window. I'm going to go back to my questions for a little bit. Another one of my geekier questions was sort of about scene summary,
Mm.
especially in the first section of the novel. I think that section's sort of pulling double duty compared to the rest because there's this section at the beginning that sort of goes from childhood and gets us to a certain age of the characters where we're learning all about them. But it's like it sort of sets with history of the friendship, the broader social political underpinnings of the era they're in and going to be entering into as adults. Anyway, it just carries the reader really far, really fast. And I was interested, you said you publish short fiction as well, because I think it's accomplished really beautifully. And there's little like micro scenes, almost like a series of micro scenes that have this cumulative effect. We're not really dwelling on like this one instance from childhood, but here's a bunch of little ones over and over. And in each of these little scenes, we get a key detail or a key characterization, especially. We sort of get to know the characters, those little key moments. Can you talk a little bit about your approach to backstory in the book, maybe especially in this first section where the backstory, because it's not an info dump. It's this really neat way of reading the beginning of the story that's almost functioning like short fiction to me in that economy of space to deliver a lot of just punchy moments. So it says punchy moments. I didn't write that down in my question, but I was like, this is so many good punchy moments to keep it going and pull me in. And then it sort of settles into the pace of the novel. So how did you handle backstory? Is that a fair way my description at all fair to what you were thinking of when you're in that first section?
I love punchy moments. Yeah, thanks for saying that. I think, what you're seeing is the cumulative end result of so much deletion. Like there is just so much more to that section. I feel like that section was probably, I mean, right now as it stands, the three main sections in the book are about 25,000 words each. And they're pretty much almost exactly the same word count, which I also obsessively like went in and tried to like make that happen. But I feel like they were probably at least double each, especially the Giselle section, because as you mentioned, there was so much kind of backstory that had to be written and known in order to whittle it down to like the more discrete punchy moments, right? So yeah, it's really a question of balance, I think. It's like you want to put that information there, but then you also have to be really economical about it, and you have to be very aware about where it might be slowing the story down. So I was really sort of strategic in terms of putting information in, not putting too much in, keeping it to a minimum. Like it's usually my impulse to overwrite. I definitely feel like I'm an overwriter, so I have to work really hard in terms of like chipping away at it, right? So then I kind of like go in the other direction where I just very obsessively end up trimming, to make sure that you get hopefully just the right amount of backstory without slowing it down.
Thank you. Um, so another interesting thing on this one, and we hinted on this a little bit earlier, is sort of interconnectivity. And maybe in this case, I'm thinking interconnectivity between the sections.
Mhm.
When I write, I know I'm always working to make a bunch of little things connect between disparate parts of the novel and things I just sort of assume that no one is ever going to notice except me because I did them. But at the same time, I feel like even if people don't notice it, just adds some like connective strength, even if it's completely invisible to the reader. Anyway, I'm wondering if you have a similar process as you write, as you revise,
Mhm.
and how those novel sections of the different sections are connected, and maybe and especially is there something you think that I probably missed in reading the sections, that's something you
Mhm.
were doing that I missed that you would expect the normal reader to miss as they went through the book?
I don't know if there's anything I feel like I would expect people to miss. That's I kind of love that question about like, what do you think nobody got?
I hope
But
that I hope that does not imply too much derogatorily about the
right,
body of
no,
the
no, no,
book.
it's like a secret thing that all the writers have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's definitely like the micro connections, like I mentioned, and then the macro connections, right? Of like the larger kind of exterior storyline or external storyline between like the different industries, between New York City over time is probably also the connectivity, right? Like it's very much a New York novel set over the span of 60 years, and I guess I kind of think of it as like it's sort of, I mean, so much of the book is around performance art and performance pieces, and in a way and archives, and in a way the book is like an archive itself or performance piece itself, and that's sort of where it's like hinting at towards the end, but I don't want to give the ending away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. A question just popped up in the chat.
Mhm.
Speaking of balance between backstory and the current story with a book that has a lot of past present jumps, you have a technique for addressing that in a working manuscript. Do you go through and highlights what's backstory, for example, in order to evaluate?
Yeah, I definitely do. I do that a lot. And in the throes of revision, which is probably like my favorite part of the process, when you get to really, when you have all the raw material to work with, and then you get to play with it and figure out like what to do and how to make it better. That I feel like is so much fun. And so I'll often like end up printing it out. And I'll use everything. I'll use like, I love index cards and post-it notes and, Scrivener. I love Scrivener. I don't know who's a fan of Scrivener here, but just all these methods to try to figure out like what the balance is and how to get the balance right. So I'll sometimes like highlight or like underline in different color pens, like where's their backstory? Where are we kind of dipping out of the present moment in time to go in the backstory, and then you can sort of see it, like especially if you print it out, you can see it sort of laid out. And you can see whether there's a disparity, like when we're dipping too much into backstory, when we're spending too much time in it. If there's like 5 pages of backstory to every 2 pages of present day story, is there a way you can sort of space it out? Is there a way that the little bits of backstory can be told in a different way? Do we have to flash back, for instance, and sort of drop out of time? Or can those pieces of information be put in different ways, like through dialogue or through like thought? Or also like, are they all even necessary? And if the backstory is kind of overwhelming the present day narrative, maybe the backstory is a present day narrative.
Yeah, thank you. I think that leads a little bit to another set of questions I had, which was about memory. I mean, in a way, obviously, all fiction is an exploration of memory, but I mean, this piece is titled Memory Piece. Memory's in the title, so I think I'm safe to assume that memory is a part of what we're dealing with here.
Right.
So what were you sort of aiming to discover or reveal about the act of remembering, and how do you sort of lean into that murky multiplicity of memory? Because I think that's also one of the things, that you have the 3 characters who have different memories of the same events. Yeah, what was your exploration of memory here, and what was that sort of multiplicity of memory havers allowing you to do?
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know, it's like another place where balance feels important, right? Like it feels very imperative to remember, I think, when like history can be overwritten in so many ways, or just like the act of forgetting can feel very violent, I guess, right? Like right, like in terms of erasing certain parts of history. On the other hand, I feel like there's also like a seductiveness to memory, especially to nostalgia, which is something that I feel like the book looks at, right? Like it's so attractive to spend time in nostalgia, right? Because it's also so, as you mentioned, murky, and also just like false, right? It's like a false representation of the past that maybe never really existed because we're kind of recreating it in our heads. And to me, I think even the act of writing the book kind of forced me to confront some of that in my own life. Like I've been a very a regular journal keeper and a record keeper for years and years. I've been keeping a daily log of my life for decades at this point. I started writing a diary when I was 5, right? And at some point, there's a part of the book where Giselle, my character, does a performance piece where she writes a bunch of memories down and then burns them. And actually, in the process of writing this book, I ended up shredding the majority of my journals. And because I realized like there was just too much weight, I think, given to, I don't know, just like I felt weighed down by memory and by the past, and kind of like felt that it was getting me stuck in like an energetic way. And so I guess you could say that the act of writing the book and the characters themselves sort of, ended up influencing my actual life.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I would not have guessed that some of those things were, there are things in the book that are familiar from what you just said, and I don't think I would have realized that they were quite as personal from that. So yeah, mining the personal stuff a little bit there is interesting as well. I was thinking the same thing, so I'll go. We have a compliment from the chat. Your top is really amazing.
Oh, thank you.
I was thinking, oh, I should do that, but no, I'm not gonna do that. Someone else did, so I'm allowed to now. Um, and all right, yeah, just a quick reminder, we'll probably have time for maybe a couple more questions that come in from the chat window. So if you have those, please drop them in now, so we still have time for them. In the meantime, I'm going to go to the topic of speculation, because I
Mm.
like in this book that we basically get the first two-thirds, now I know, especially down almost to the word count, the first two sections. There's a fourth section too. I guess it's not quite two-thirds then, but are in. I mean, they're more or less a realist novel. I mean, this is characters occurring in a past that appears familiar in terms of the world of performance art in New York in the 90s and the dot-com bubble in the 90s as well. But the third section comes along, and suddenly we're thrust into the future, and the future is therefore speculative. There's only the only way to write the future. Um, what's your relationship to speculation? What's your thoughts on the power of speculation in fiction, especially fiction that isn't maybe purely speculative in the sci-fi or fantasy or horror sense?
Mm. Yeah, it's such an interesting question. I think a lot about, the author Samuel Delany said this like known quote about how science fiction, or I guess speculative fiction, is like not actually about the future, but it's in dialogue with the present, right? Because obviously, as you mentioned, we can't write the future because we haven't lived it yet. Um, so I feel like, also like how you mentioned, all fiction in its way is speculative, right? We're using imagination to imagine like both the past, the present, and the future. And I think in this book, the speculative future sort of allowed me, and hopefully the reader as well, to kind of trace how we might get to where we might be going. So in other words, it's imagining a possible future and also drawing like a connection between, as you mentioned, like the actual real past, right? Which is in some ways also a fictionalized past, and trying to figure out like, how did we get here, and like where might we be going? What are some possibilities, and also what are some possibilities in terms of how we might live in this speculative future?
I mean, I think too, there's sort of a lie we tell ourselves that a lot more is speculative, especially in fiction, than I mean, there's always speculation. It's just the type of speculation that's going on in terms.
Right, right,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. I mean, Jane Austen speculating all over the place about a nice rich guy who doesn't seem nice at the beginning. That's a speculation.
Yeah, speculation
Um,
is like what are our characters actually thinking? We don't
yeah.
actually know.
Back to the chat window. Could you share a bit about your daily writing practice?
Hmm. I like this question because I don't have a daily writing practice. And I like to say that because I feel like there's a lot of pressure for people to write every day. And I like to say that I definitely don't write every day. And I think it's okay. So, my daily practice is that I do a lot of other things. And sometimes if I'm inspired or have the time, I sit down and I write. And I have a pretty flexible schedule. So, I think that can take any form in terms of like, it can be writing at night or it can be writing in the morning. I It could be writing in a notebook, it could be writing on my computer and my desk. But a lot of times it's just reading, and sort of interacting with other writing and other forms of art, and also things that aren't even art. And I find like those are kind of my ways into the daily writing practice without actually writing.
Well, I mean, can I ask, like, what are the other forms of art and not forms of art that hop into that are part of your writing practice?
Sure. Yeah, I love visual art and film and just like anything that's non-text based, I feel, because I mean I do read a lot, but I feel like it's very hard for me to turn off my writer brain, even as a reader. Like I'm always reading as a writer. So even if it's a book that's like a totally different genre, and it's just like sheer escapist pleasure. Like I can never fully escape. Right?
You're noticing the 6 double letters in a sentence and
Oh
being
yeah, I know. I wish I could, but I'm just like still thinking like, oh, how did this person do these like characters? Like, what's happening with this story? You know, like always trying to guess how the story is going to end. If somehow I'm going to win a, like extra points or something. So it's just such a relief, I think, to my nervous system to like engage in something that doesn't have words. Like sometimes I like to go to like the museum and look at like an Agnes Martin or like a Rothko, just like a big square of color, and I feel myself sort of calm down. I'm like, there's no words. It's just like, it's a red square. It's a blue square. I'm here looking at it.
I got an Albers on the wall, so yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
What we need sometimes. Um, if the characters have different memory of the past, how do you, as the writer, reveal the quote unquote truth to the reader?
That's a good question. Well, I guess the reader can always make their own assumptions, and it can also be revealed through narrative, especially if it's in third person, right? So you have this sort of distance between, at least, like, for example, in this book, you have scenes where one character might think, you know, my friend, I'm annoyed at my friend because she did X, Y, and Z, right? And then you find out in another section that the friend is like, actually, this is what happened, and I'm annoyed at person A because of this, right? But then you can sort of see the truth come out both from number one, like other characters, or you can sort of read between the lines and see that the characters might be a little paranoid or like a little insecure or sort of constructing their own version of the truth, right? So yeah, it's sort of like trying to figure out how to convey that.
How comfortable are you with a lack of definitive truth in something?
I love a lack of definitive truth.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm all for it.
I sort of wonder with the
Yeah.
perspective. Yeah. And someone asking, is that the unreliable narrator at that point?
Right, right. Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very importantly, do you have a cat?
Do I have a cat? I do. I actually have two cats. So yes, yes.
Three. Three. If you're asking because you heard a cat mewing in the background a little while ago, that was me. That was my fault.
Okay, that was your cat, one of your three cats.
Yeah. Oh gosh, we're getting a bunch of quick ones. Let's go through these real quick before we run out of time. Has your family read your book, and what did they think?
Well, this book just came out a few weeks ago, so they have not read it yet. They did read the first book and enjoyed it. I personally like to imagine no one I know or no one who is related to me ever reading anything I will ever write. And that's usually the only way I can actually finish writing a book, even though I know the truth is if I'm lucky to get it published, they will probably when they read it. But I try to exist in that avoidant tunnel for as long as possible, even maybe after they actually read.
Has your cat ever finished writing a passage for you if you were too tired?
You know, that would be really amazing. And I don't understand why he hasn't done that yet.
It's
So
like the Ratatouille rat,
really
right?
feel like that should
Yeah.
start happening.
Or the cobbler elves that come in
Yeah.
overnight, and finish
I
them.
don't know. I mean, it might just be like, you know, one letter. And I feel like there are times in which one of the cats has like fallen asleep on the keyboard or like mistakenly deleted something.
All right. You mentioned you enjoy film. What's a favorite movie?
Oh, what's a favorite
A
movie?
favorite.
A favorite movie. I actually just watched All of Us Strangers, which I don't know if you've seen it, but I really enjoyed it. And I found it to be very literary. It's actually based on a book. So even though apparently it's not really that much of a strict adaptation, but I really enjoyed it.
All right, great. I'm going to go to the last question from me,
Sure.
which is the final question we like to ask everyone. What's one piece of advice you'd give to a writer just starting out?
One piece of advice. Well, you know, number one, I would say maybe don't write every day, and don't listen to any advice. But also, I think it's just really important to ground yourself in like why you want to do this and why you want to tell this particular story if you're working on a story or, you know, on a novel. Because there's so many forces out there that will sort of like easily dissuade you from that, I feel. So it's just really important to like remember the value of your own work and why you're doing it, and that like no one can tell this story or do this project better than you can, because it's yours.
That's a beautiful place to end the evening. So, Lisa, thank you so much for joining me. Everyone, get a copy of Memory Peace if you're able from Lisa Ko. It's an amazing new novel. We just put the link back in. Go to your local independent bookseller. And everyone, thank you all so much for coming out on this Thursday evening, and we hope that you will join us again in the future. Lisa, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, have a good evening, everybody.
Bye.